Calvin and Lucy Brown, married for 12 years, had already been in the first court-ordered session of three-way counseling for an hour and a half. Calvin was attending only at the insistence of his attorney. Prenuptial agreements were a relatively new phenomenon in the legal system, and Calvin's attorney wanted to dot all the I's and all the T's. The previous 90 minutes had passed in conversation between the counselor and Lucy, while Calvin sat in silence with notepad and pen in hand. Periodically, he scribbled something on the sheet. Lucy's pleas touched the heartstrings of the hardened psychologist Henry, who was also impressed with the way Lucy accepted all the blame, dispelling Calvin's fears that her infidelity meant he had failed her in some way. Lucy had also avoided many of the silly excuses that people in her situation inevitably come up with. Henry was pleased that Lucy had chosen this approach. After all, she had recommended it to her herself when they had met for their solo session 3 days ago. Finally, Lucy fell silent. All that could be heard in the room was the faint ticking of the analog clock on the wall beside them and the scratching of Calvin making notes in the notebook resting in his lap. Henry let the silence linger. Experience told him that most people in awkward situations liked to fill the silence. A minute, 2. Henry looked at Lucy, who opened her mouth to speak. Henry shook his head slightly. Lucy took that subtle sign and closed her mouth. Henry decided to give Calvin, who was still writing, another minute. If he didn't say anything by then, Henry would voluntarily suggest that Calvin seriously consider what his genuinely remorseful wife was going through and inform him of one common statistic. Those who were caught cheating and saw it devastate loved ones often became incredibly faithful. Calvin hissed, and a slight smile appeared on his face. Good, Henry thought, lifting the corners of his mouth in a half-smile. It was usually better to get the offended party to voluntarily share information than to force it out of them. Nice job, Lucy. I give you 9 points out of 10. Henry's smile faded. He was confused, and judging by the look on Lucy's face, so was she. The counselor came to her senses first. As she'd said earlier today, her colleague was a seasoned womanizer, and she simply didn't have the strength to resist his advances. I assure you, if you forgive her, I can work with her to give her the strength and knowledge to make sure this never happens again. Calvin only sighed. They say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Are you saying that your wife can't learn to protect herself, and therefore your feelings in the future? No, not at all, Mrs. Parkinson. I meant that you've been at university for how long now? 4 years? 6, actually. I've got a master's degree. 6 years, and you obviously haven't learned anything. Offended, Henry straightened in his seat. I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, that was rude and completely inappropriate. You think? To avoid further protests from the counselor, Calvin pulled an electronic device from his pocket and pressed a button. Lucy's voice came out of the device, begging for forgiveness. She swore it was a one-time mistake and that he, Calvin, could take it to the bank. They listened as she admitted to hurting him and how ashamed she was that she had caused him so much pain. The recording ended when the indignant counselor interrupted loudly. Do you realize how hurtful and inappropriate it is to record our session? Not only that, but I believe it is completely illegal in this state to record someone without their permission and consent, and I certainly refuse to do so. That's fine, because Margaret didn't do it. Henry was too angry and confused to notice that the female half of the couple had just dropped her chin to her chest and was diligently imitating a beat. Henry couldn't remember when she had been more offended. Who's Margaret? She was our counselor 2 years ago when I last caught Lucy cheating. It was recorded then. My wife is a persuasive witch, isn't she? She fooled me then, that's for sure. Lucy continued to stare at the floor at her feet. Calvin watched with satisfaction as she and Henry engaged in a silent competition to see who would have the brighter scarlet-red face. Henry thought with annoyance at the thoroughness with which this skillful storyteller had fooled her. Perhaps it would have been easier for her to realize that Lucy was lying so convincingly, since the first person she had convinced with her bullshit was herself. Taking advantage of the embarrassed silence of both women, Calvin put an end to the charade. "Lest there be any doubt, Lucy, I am going to enforce with extreme ferocity the terms of the marriage contract you signed 2 years ago. That means you will leave my house with only your personal belongings, minus all the jewelry I bought you, including the 2 rings you are now wearing." Calvin paused, mentally repeating the emphasis on the word "my" in the previous sentence. "If I had divorced you 2 years ago, the court would have awarded you half of everything. Now you get nothing. And the only cost was that I had to give up my pride for a while. Don't worry, you didn't hurt me too much this time. Despite what the good counselor says, I think deep down I knew you would cheat on me again, and that's why I didn't put any more emotion into our relationship." Lucy fell silent and stared at the floor. The depth of her punishment and loss still hadn't been realized. Henry, still embarrassed by her naivete, flinched at Calvin's cold, unemotional demeanor. Apparently, he was as unemotional as he said he was. Either that, or he was an even better actor than his wife. Neither woman spoke, but the offended husband wasn't done yet. "I don't know where you're going or what you're doing, but frankly, I don't care. The locks will be changed in an hour tops, so please don't embarrass us both by banging on the door. Try mobilizing your family and our friends against me, and the video clips I have of you and your current lover, plus the last one, will mysteriously end up in the possession of everyone you know. And I mean everyone. I'm sure at least some of them won't be so understanding after hearing you squealing as you cheat on me in our marital bed." Calvin paused to stop the rapid escalation of his temper. Taking a dozen deep breaths, he regained full control of himself. "Once the divorce is final, we can talk about dating, Alice. Sign the divorce this week and I'll be generous with dates, fight back, and you can kiss her goodbye forever." Lucy lifted her head, and fear and anger flashed in her eyes. Neither reaction went unnoticed by the counselor. Lucy hadn't mentioned her daughter in that session or this one, but then she seemed like a typical 21st century narcissist, self-centered to the extreme. She was so obsessed with what she could lose that everything else took a back seat. Henry looked back to see the pain that filled Lucy's face as she finally found the words that were rushing out of her brain. But you can't take my little girl away from me. She needs me. I can't live without her." The pain Lucy felt at these words from her ex-husband was written all over her contorted face. Henry thought, if only these idiots would think of the consequences of their actions before committing various crimes, I'd be out of a job. She reached out to Lucy, hoping her client wouldn't have a complete breakdown. Feeling like an emotional dead fish in her counselor's eyes, Calvin said quietly, "Maybe you should have thought about that before, quote, seducing an expert, unquote. It's all spelled out in the post-contract. Talk to me again and you lose everything, including custody of Alice. But she needs me." "Bullshit, Lucy. She's 13 years old. I can handle it just as well as you can. Anyway, this isn't where we should be washing dirty laundry. You cheated, I got you back. You signed a post-nuptial agreement and promised not to get involved again. I suspected something wrong, investigated, and caught you cheating again. Don't commit a crime if you can't do time, right?" Calvin stood up and looked at his ex-wife, who was kneeling on the floor with her hands clasped together in supplication, tears streaming down her face. The look of anguish on her face told everyone present that perhaps for the first time in this whole sordid affair, she was actually feeling remorse. The consequences of her impulsive actions had finally hit home. Out of her last strength, Lucy let out a short plea. "You will not take Alice away from me. I will fight you every step of the way." The counselor stood as a helpless witness to the borderline evil smirk that appeared on Calvin's face. Please. My contact said it's a cast iron agreement and it will give me an excuse to release my own edited videos. Try appearing in public after they're released, Lucy. With those words, the offended husband left the room. Henry looked at the devastated woman he left behind and sighed. She had better start acting now if she wanted to avoid a complete mental breakdown, especially if the aforementioned prenup was approved in her husband's favor. Having your daughter taken away from you is probably every mother's nightmare. Calvin Brown sat in the car until the adrenaline had worn off and his breathing returned to normal. Then he drove home through the supermarket and liquor store, grabbing a bottle of bourbon for himself and a nice piece of fish for dinner for himself and Alice. Salmon was her favorite dish. Tonight was the beginning of their life together. What he did tonight mattered. Placing his hand on the doorknob, he paused, determined to stick to his usual routine if possible, for Alice's sake. Pushing the door open, Calvin Brown spoke in a loud voice, well aware that Alice was increasingly losing her hearing. Alice, walk! The elderly Jack Russell Terrier jumped out of the basket and came over to greet his father, wagging his tail so hard that his hind paws scraped across the floorboards. Subscribe to our channel to keep your partner from cheating on you, and listen to the next story because this story is nothing compared to the next.